communists trying to control our lives. And I have to say, this really makes me laugh because I work with a lot of scientists. My husband is a scientist. I used to be a scientist. Most scientists I know can't even control their own lives, much less anybody else's. They refer to environmentalists as watermelons, green on the outside but red on the inside. George Will, who writes for the Washington Post and again has been a major source of climate change denial, has called environmentalism a green tree with red roots. And Senator James Inhofe, who many of you are familiar with, a senator from Oklahoma who tried to disprove climate science by bringing a snowball into the US Congress, has threatened to indict climate scientists for conspiracy to lie to Congress and accuse them, and also me, of being part of the liberal conspiracy to bring down global capitalism, to which I say that liberals should be so organized. And of course, in presidential elections. Back in 2011, when presidential candidate Mitt Romney said he believed that humans had contributed to global warming, he was immediately attacked by former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, who said that the push to address climate change is, quote, the newest excuse to take control of our lives. And of course, at present, all of the Republican candidates have expressed doubt about the scientific conclusions regarding man-made climate change. Most egregiously, Donald Trump has called it the global warming hoax created by and for the Chinese. Now, there are many obvious things wrong with these claims, but there's one that I think might not be obvious to many people, especially the younger people in the audience. The fact is that American environmentalism is not a green tree with red roots. It doesn't even have liberal roots. The origins of American environmentalism are not to be found in the left-wing movements of, say, the 1920s International Workers of the World or the Socialist Workers' Party. They're actually to be found in the progressive republicanism of Teddy Roosevelt, Forest Service Director Gifford Pinchot, and of course that famous communist John D. Rockefeller. Throughout most of the 20th century in the United States, there was a bipartisan consensus on the importance of environmental protection and pollution control. This is just a partial list of some of the major legislation, environmental legislation that was passed in the United States starting in 1917 and running all the way up through 1977. All of these landmark pieces of legislation passed the US Congress by large bipartisan measures. In fact, the Wilderness Act passed the Senate by a vote of 95-1. And for a while I was trying to figure out who that one person was, and I finally found out it was a Democrat who voted against it because he didn't think it went far enough. The Environmental Protection Agency, which the right wing loves to bash, Rick Perry wanted to get rid of it when he could remember which agency it was created by a Republican president, Richard Nixon. And President Nixon signed into law the key pieces of environmental legislation that create the backbone of environmental protection in this country today. The Clean Air Act extension, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and of course he approved the ban on DDT use in the USA. And by the way, since I'm in Ohio, I should mention this, although I don't know how to pronounce your wonderful river. Cuyahoga? Oh, so you guys don't even know how to pronounce it. Okay, well, whatever that river is, the burning of your river was a major impetus towards the, some of the Clean Water Act legislations from the 60s and 70s. So, you know, environmental protection wasn't just a liberal cause, and it wasn't just a cause of a few places in America. It was something that across the United States, from California to New York to Ohio to Florida, people cared about, and people still do actually care about environmental protection. But things began to change politically in the 1980s, and a lot of things changed, but there's three that I think are particularly important for this story. The first is that in response to the stalled economic growth of the 1970s, Ronald Reagan came to power in the United States arguing that the way to stimulate economic growth was to have less government and less regulation, as promoted by the Chicago economist Milton Friedman, shown here in this picture. So the idea was to deregulate the marketplace, release the magic of the market, and that would generate jobs and prosperity. The second thing, as I've already mentioned, is that the Cold War ended. When the Berlin Wall fell down, for many conservatives, particularly here in the United States, the collapse of Soviet communism was taken as a vindication of free market capitalism, but also as proof of the linkage between free market economics and personal freedom. So the Soviet Union wasn't just an economically stifled country, it was also a politically stifled country. And they began to argue that if capitalism was the best system, then the best form of capitalism was the most extreme form of it, that is to say, the most unregulated form. And so they started to begin to argue for undoing, for dismantling the environmental protection, the trade protection, the labor protections that had been put in place through the previous really 90 to 100 years of American history. And the third thing, and this is what historians call contingency, it has nothing to do with the other two, it just happened to happen at the same time. So in some ways, this is a really bad luck story for scientists, because the evidence of acid rain, the ozone hole, and anthropogenic climate change all began to coalesce at this time in the late 70s into the 80s and the early 90s. So at this crucial moment when the American government is turning against regulation, scientists are discovering and proving problems that seem to demand it. And that puts science on a collision course with conservative thinking in this country, a collision course that I would argue we're still traveling. Because admitting the reality of climate change or the effects of tobacco use means admitting the reality of the failures of free market capitalism, or at least a failure of free market capitalism, the reality of market failure. It means acknowledging what economists call external costs, sometimes often referred to as negative externalities, because academics always have to come up with more complicated names for things. But these are costs, the price of doing business or the cost of using a product like tobacco or fossil fuels that are not reflected in the price of that cost, not addressed by free market economics. And governance is needed to remedy these market failures. And this, we argued in the book, is the common thread that links these otherwise very different issues like tobacco and climate change or acid rain and ozone, because they're all market failures. They're scientifically very different, but they have this common thread. There are problems that arose from activities like smoking or fossil fuel use that generated large, substantial, serious external costs. Costs that were not reflected in the price we paid for those goods or services, and costs that are being borne by people who did not reap the benefits of using those products. Nicholas Stern, the author of the Stern Report on Climate Change for the UK government and former chief economist of the World Bank, has called anthropogenic global warming the greatest and widest-ranging market failure ever seen. In fact, economists now argue that the costs of climate change are so great that they threaten the very prosperity that economic activity is intended to generate. And this is why climate scientists have been attacked. Because it wasn't economists doing economics who discovered these market failures. It was scientists doing science. It was science that led to this conclusion that we had these market failures and we needed some form of governance to fix them. And global warming became the biggest fight of all because energy consumption is at the root of all economic activity. So how do you remedy a market failure? Well, there are many different ways that market failures can be fixed, but they all involve some kind of intervention that originates outside the market. So if we look at how we solve these other problems, and of course the good news in the story is that we actually did solve these other problems. We didn't just throw up our hands and say, it's too hard. We fixed these things. So we banned DDT use in the United States. We controlled acid rain in the Midwest and pollution in Southern California through emissions trading systems. In the case of ozone, we banned the chemicals that cause ozone depletion. And tobacco is really interesting from a political and social point of view because we got tobacco use under control in this country not with just one thing, but with a mix of policy instruments that included heavy tobacco taxes, prosecution of the industry for fraudulent behavior, and then things that were bottom-up, bans on smoking in public places, often just passed by local communities. So we solved these various problems and market failures with a variety of different interventions, and those interventions worked. And we did not find ourselves living in a Soviet-style dictatorship. Now, I've sometimes said that climate change denial is what sociologists and psychologists call implicatory denial. That is to say, the merchants of doubt denied the facts about climate change, the reality of climate change, and the other problems, because they didn't like the character of the solutions. That is to say, they resisted accepting the reality of these problems because they resisted the implication that the free market had failed in some significant way. And this, I think, remains true of many people today. We don't want to accept how bad climate change really is, in part because we like the way we live and we don't really want to change it. And that's not just true of deniers, that's true of most of us. But the good news, I think, is that these insights give us some ideas how we might move past denial. So I promised I wouldn't leave you depressed. I want to end then with a little bit of sort of good news about how I think we actually can move forward on the issue. So the first two are sort of conceptual, and then the rest are about actual solutions. So I think one of the first things that's extremely important, especially for journalists and journalism students, is to recognize the problem of facsimile science. These pseudo-scientific reports and claims that are dressed up to look like science, but they're not. Citizens and journalists need to understand that denial works primarily by creating confusion. And this is done largely through the creation of claims that look and sound scientific, but they aren't. So we need to recognize facsimile science, not be fooled by it, ask the question, who's really writing this? And who are the people who are saying this? And who's funding this? And if it's being funded by groups that are not scientific, then we shouldn't be giving it equal time with science. We might discuss the Cato Institute deserves a place at the table when we talk about policy, but they don't deserve equal time when they spread disinformation and, frankly, lies about science. A second thing, and this is complicated, and it's actually the basis of my new work, so I'm just sticking in here so I don't feel like I'm just always saying the same old thing all the time. But we need to understand that there's actually a very long history in the United States of the private sector, or at least some portions of the private sector, making exaggerated claims that if the government regulates their industry or if the government gets involved, the whole economy will collapse and we'll lose our freedom to live in the Soviet Union. And it turns out this whole story is older than even Eric Conley and I realized. We thought we had done something pretty swell when we were able to prove that this started in the tobacco industry, but now I've actually discovered it goes back a lot further. So this is why I have to keep doing work as an academic. So I just wanted to show you this advertisement. This advertisement comes from 1962, and you can see the picture is of the Berlin Wall. It's of a sad-looking young man standing behind barbed wire next to what might be a guard, and the caption says, "How is freedom lost?" So what do you think this might be an advertisement for? Anybody care to guess? Barbed wire? Cigarettes? Hats? No idea. Nobody, somebody must have a guess. No?
How about the electric power industry?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's the electric power industry. How did you know that?
I read it.
Oh, you read it. Good for you. Well, that's a very good lesson, because all of this is hidden in plain sight. You know, a lot of the stuff we found to write Merchants of Doubt was not that hard to find. So, lesson to students: read what your professors put in front of you. So, the correct answer is the electric power industry. This was part of an advertising campaign to oppose government building of dams, of hydroelectric power, mostly in the West, to generate public-generated electricity, because the private sector was afraid it wouldn't be able to compete against the federal government. Now, whether or not those dams were a good idea is a legitimate question, and personally I'm not actually a giant fan of federal dams. But the idea that if you build a dam, you somehow end up living in East Berlin, that's, in my view, not legitimate. So anyway, so this is actually a very old story, and we need to be aware of it, that the private sector kind of exaggerates the threat of government involvement in the marketplace. They've been doing it for a long time, and they do it by making us think that if we let the government control tobacco or build dams, that the next thing you know, we're living in East Berlin. Okay, third, this is the better part, focus on solutions. The whole point of climate change denial is to avoid implementing solutions, right? That the fossil fuel industry doesn't want us to move away from fossil fuels. So I think the most important thing we can do now going forward is to focus on solutions. Not get mired in the debates about the reality of climate change, not debate deniers, and not even get mired in the reality of the details of the problem, but to talk about some examples of solutions. So that's what I'm going to do in the remaining few minutes of my talk. So I have some examples that I want to show you. These are all real-life examples. They all exist. They're all things that are happening in the world today. So none of these are just hypothetical. And a number of these are places I've had the opportunity to visit personally. So I can talk about places where I've actually been and actually seen it. And it's not just an idea. So this is a building that generates more energy than it uses. This is the Bullitt Center in Seattle, Washington. It generates 52% more energy than it uses, largely through photovoltaic electricity. And the way it does this, I don't know if this, oh, this does work, good, okay. So if you look at this building, now admittedly, it's a little bit misleading because it's a sunny day in Seattle, but the building has this big roof. This roof is a giant photovoltaic array. Now you can see it also has some holes in it so light can stream down to the street below. But the two really crucial, interesting things about this building is, it is Seattle. This is one of the foggiest places in America, and yet even in the climate of Seattle, this building can generate 52% more energy than it uses and put that energy back into the grid. The other thing important about this building is that the construction costs were within the range of normal commercial construction in Seattle. And that was done very deliberately. The designers of this building wanted a proof of concept that they could show you didn't have to be rich to build a building like this. You didn't have to be a Chardonnay drinking, brie-eating liberal. You could build a commercial building at normal commercial costs and save money. And this building is operating, and the people who work in it like it. It's a very beautiful building, has a lot of natural light. It's a good place to work. So that's one example. Now here's another one. This is the microgrid approach. So the Bullitt Center is very much focused on connecting them to the grid, feeding energy into the grid, and then, you know, if it's a particularly cold and cloudy day, there may be some days when they pull energy back out of the grid, but it's a net positive energy producer. But some people don't want to do that. Some people would rather be off the grid completely. And in particular, in Australia, there are communities that are far from the grid where it's expensive. Transmission is expensive. So this is a company called Zen Australia, Zen Energy Australia, and this is a group of entrepreneurs, it's a private sector initiative to build communities off-grid based on solar photovoltaics with battery storage. So many of you have read a lot about Elon Musk. He's doing a lot of work to try to improve battery storage because with solar power, either you have to be connected to a grid so you can get electricity back on cloudy days, or you have to have storage so you can store the extra and have it when you need it, for literally storing for a rainy day. So this is what they're doing at Zen Energy. Here's another nice example from Australia, off-grid solar thermal. So we've heard a lot in the United States about photovoltaic electricity generation, but you can also heat and cool buildings with hot and cold water, heated or cooled by the sun without electricity at all. So this again is a private sector initiative, a company called Fluid Solar based in Elizabeth, South Australia, and this building is going to be entirely heated and cooled with passive solar. Hot water directly from the sun to warm it in winter, and cool water through evaporative cooling to cool it in summer. And it's done by laying a series of pipes under the floors of the building. So this building is still under construction, so I was very happy to be able to see it under construction, because once it's built, you won't be able to see all this. So there's going to be a floor laid over these pipes. And it's very simple technology. These are just pipes with hot and cold water running through them. If a pipe begins to leak, you just pick up a part of the floor and you fix it. Nothing fancy, no moving parts, really simple to build, simple to fix, and simple to understand. So this isn't done yet, but it's going to be done hopefully soon. And they're also working on a residential community, 24 low-income housing units that will all be renewably energy powered. And I really like this example. I know we have someone here from South Australia, but probably besides our one person here from Adelaide, is there anybody else here who's ever been to Elizabeth, South Australia? No, it's not exactly a big, oh, you've been there, okay. It's not exactly a big tourist destination. It's a kind of Rust Belt town. They had a General Motors plant there that has now shut down, and I think about 2,000 people were put out of work. So it's a town with high unemployment, a lot of drug issues. It's a town that's suffering. But if you could build residential housing for low-income people that's all renewable, again, proving you don't have to be rich to do this. Ordinary middle-class and working-class people can afford this. And I think that's really important, because if it's going to scale up, it can't just be for rich people. Okay, one more example from Australia. This is Sundrop Farms. This is fossil fuel-free agriculture. So as many of you know, the bulk of greenhouse gases are produced during energy use, driving our cars, heating our homes, using electricity, but a significant amount of fossil fuel is also used in agriculture. So this is a startup in the town of Port Augusta, South Australia, again, not exactly a big tourist destination, and what they're doing here is using solar power to desalinate seawater, and using the solar powered desalinated seawater to water crops in greenhouses with no use of fossil fuels. In fact, the only fossil fuels being used here are the trucks that are bringing the tomatoes that they grow to supermarkets. and their tomatoes are now being sold in ordinary supermarkets across Australia. So that's a pretty exciting development, I think. Again, all of these need to be scaled up, but in theory, at least all of them can be. So I think, knowing what we know about the reasons why people are nervous or resistant to acting on climate, I think that wherever possible, we should embrace market-based solutions. After all, climate science is not an excuse to expand government or bring in socialism by the back door. Climate change is a problem that needs to be solved before many people get hurt, and we all get a lot poorer as we start to have to spend more and more money dealing with the impacts. But we also have to recognize that the free market by itself, the private sector by itself, has not produced the technology that we need at the rate and scale that we need. So just to remind you, the UN Framework Convention was signed in 1992. The private sector has had a quarter of a century to deal with this issue. So I think the biggest question is, how do we get the technology we need on the scale we need? And there, however, there is also more good news. And the good news is we don't need a miracle. The technologies we need already exist. And I'm very excited about this recent work. This just got published about a month ago from a group of scientists at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the University of Colorado Boulder. So this is an energy modeling project. And what they did was to take weather data that tells us how much sunlight there is in any given place in America at any given moment, how much wind, and to say if we could actually harness that capacity, what would it look like? And what they showed in this model was that all U.S. electricity needs, everything we need, can be met with up to 80% emissions reduction relative to 1990 levels and without increasing electricity costs. It can be done with currently existing technologies, including a reasonable amount of growth in energy demand, and without storage. So this seems almost too good to be true. I mean, I love Elon Musk. I think he's a cool guy. If I could afford it, I'd buy a Tesla. But really? Without storage? And the answer, so how do they do that? And here's the answer. It's really interesting. By moving from regionally divided grids to an integrated grid. So I'm becoming, like I am basically a geek at heart, I've become really boring at cocktail parties. I say to people, can I talk to you about grid integration? And people have no idea what I'm talking about, but it totally changes, especially if I'm on an airplane next to some business guy who tells me he doesn't believe in climate change. I say, let's not talk about climate change, let's talk about grid integration. You know, he goes, wow, this is a weird woman. So, okay, so what does that really mean? Well, it's basically a really simple concept. You make a big grid and you connect all the parts of the United States. And ideally you connect Canada and Mexico too. Why? Because think about it. Somewhere in North America, at any moment of the day, the sun is shining. It's not always sunny in Seattle, it's not always sunny in Miami, but somewhere in the United States it is. And somewhere in the United States, day or night, the wind is blowing. And somewhere in Canada or the Pacific Northwest, rivers are flowing and creating hydroelectric power. So what this model does, it takes all the existing hydroelectric, existing nuclear, and existing gas, but adds no more. So no new gas, no new nuclear, no new hydroelectric. Just keep what we have, but begin to add more solar and wind, and connect the grid so that wind from Oklahoma can go to Arizona, and sun from Arizona can come to Oklahoma, and all the rest. And it turns out that if you do that, there is enough power in the United States from renewable energies to meet all of our electricity needs. Now, there are a couple of additional things you have to do though. Obviously you have to integrate the grid, and who's going to do that? Well, who built the grid in the first place? The US government. So, although it's not inconceivable that you could build a private sector integrated grid, it's hard to imagine how that would happen. You also need what's called demand response pricing to encourage electricity efficiency. That just means basically supply and demand. That when the demand is high, the price goes up. When the demand is low, the price goes down. Lots of studies show that people are responsive to the price of electricity. It is elastic, unlike what some people have claimed in the past. So if the price is higher at 9 o'clock in the morning, a lot of people will wait and do their laundry at night. And this turns out to be really important. You can save about 30% electricity in many communities just through efficiency. And you need a high enough price for fossil fuels to discourage expanded gas capacity and encourage renewable uptake. So in other words, what we see is with the right policies, the right incentives, and the right regulations, this can happen. The technology exists, but what we're really missing is the effective governance. The keys, as I've already said, grid integration, demand response pricing, and a high enough price for fossil fuels to make renewables competitive. And that can't be done by the private sector alone. The high enough price on fossil fuels means we need carbon pricing, a carbon tax or emissions trading system. As I've already said, we need the big public investment to do the grid integration. We also probably need research on carbon sequestration. That's a different talk. I think I'll skip that. In other words, we need the right policies to push the private sector faster in the right direction. But here's one more good piece of news. This is actually happening in many places around the world already. And one of the most amazing places it's happening is Alberta, Canada. Alberta is the Texas of the North. It's the most conservative part of Canada, and it's the most dependent on fossil fuels. This is the home of the tar sands. This is the home of Fort McMurray. And they have now passed a greenhouse gas emissions plan. And it has 4 major parts. A $30 price on carbon. It's not enough, but it's a really good start. A cap on emissions from the tar sands. So they're not going to force the tar sands to shut down, but they're going to cap emissions at 100 megatons of CO2 per year and not allow any expansion beyond that. So if the tar sand operators want to do more, they have to find some way to capture and store the carbon. They're going to phase out coal completely by 2030, and they're going to commit the entire province to 30% renewable energies by 2030. Again, that's not enough, but it's a really, really good start. And this was implemented by the Alberta government, working with fossil fuel groups and environmentalists in that province. So I think if it can be done in Alberta, it can be done in Texas, and if it can be done in Texas, it can be done anywhere in the United States. But government has to play its appropriate role. That's the bottom line. The market isn't magic. Markets are human institutions, and like all institutions, they have their strengths and weaknesses, their successes and failures. So we have to reject the deification of the free market and the demonization of government. And remember that the whole point of governance is to balance competing interests, competing interpretations of freedom. And so I want to end with a quotation from Abraham Lincoln. I was just in Missouri where they still talk about the War of Northern Aggression. The United States has been through challenges before. Climate change is a big one, but it's probably not the worst we've ever faced. And I thought it was really interesting to look at what Abraham Lincoln had to say about the question of freedom in 1864, which was probably the darkest moment in U.S. history. And he wrote, "We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as the destroyer of liberty." Or as the philosopher Isaiah Berlin put it, "Liberty for wolves is death to the lambs." And the part I would like to add to that is that as disruptive climate change unfolds, it won't just be lambs that get hurt. Thank you very much.
We're going to have a brief panel discussion. That means brief remarks from the 3 of us, Bernard Debatty and Austin Fabro, professors here at the Scripps College, and myself. Our remarks will, as I said, be brief, and we will then take questions from the audience. We'll have a discussion. So I'll just dive in. Last September, Inside Climate News, a nonprofit news organization, published an article with the following title: "Exxon's own research confirmed fossil fuels' role in global warming decades ago. Top executives were warned of possible catastrophe from greenhouse effect, then led efforts to block solutions." That was the first of a series of articles resulting from many months of investigations based on internal ExxonMobil documents dating from the 1970s and interviews with former company scientists and employees. The articles describe how Exxon conducted cutting-edge climate research decades ago and then, without revealing all that it had learned, worked at the forefront of climate denial, manufacturing doubt about the scientific consensus that its own scientists had confirmed. On October 9th of last year, Naomi Oreskes published an op-ed piece in the New York Times. She wrote, Had Exxon been upfront at the time about the dangers of the greenhouse gases we were spewing into the atmosphere, we might have begun decades ago to develop a less carbon-intensive energy path to avert the worst impacts of a changing climate. Amazingly, politicians are still debating the reality of this threat, thanks in no small part to industry disinformation, close quote. Several others, including the journalist Bill McKibben, have also asserted that Exxon's profit-motivated actions blocked global action on climate change. McKibben accuses the company of lying about the state of the science. ExxonMobil's spokespeople and other defenders have argued that, in fact, they did not hide the findings of their in-house scientists, but instead funded their research, including collaborations with university scientists, and that the corporation allowed and encouraged its scientists to publish their findings in peer-reviewed journals available to the public, and that they did publish dozens of climate-related research papers. So one may wonder exactly what the true story is, and to what extent Exxon is blameworthy for misleading the public and legislators. Last October, the LA Times began publishing a series of articles on this topic. Here is a relevant quote. Throughout much of the 1980s, Exxon earned a public reputation as a pioneer in climate change research. It sponsored workshops, funded academic research, and conducted its own high-tech experiments exploring the science behind global warming. However, in an internal draft memo from 1988 entitled The Greenhouse Effect, a company public affairs manager laid out what he called the Exxon position. Toward the end of the document, after an analysis that noted the scientific consensus on the role that fossil fuels play in global warming, he wrote that the company should emphasize uncertainty. From 1990 onward, while still funding some climate-relevant research, the company started to pour millions of dollars into a campaign to cast doubt on the growing scientific consensus about climate change. Over the next 15 years, it took out prominent ads in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times, contending that climate change science was murky and uncertain. Why did this corporation, which had been a leader in climate research, start this campaign to discredit the scientific consensus about it? According to the LA Times, the Los Angeles Times, and I quote, "The answer, gleaned from a trove of archived company documents and the recollections of former employees, is that Exxon feared a growing public consensus would lead to financially burdensome policies." ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel corporations are continuing to fund disinformation about climate change to mislead the public. Yesterday, Bloomberg News reported that ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, and 3 oil industry groups together spend $115 million a year on advocacy designed to obstruct climate change policy. This is according to new estimates released by a British nonprofit research organization called Influence Map. This organization defined what influence actually means by adopting a framework spelled out in a 2013 United Nations report, which was written to help companies align their climate change policies with their lobbying and communication strategies. The 5 groups, ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, and the 3 oil industry groups, use their lobbying and communication strategies for climate obstruction. Some defenders of ExxonMobil have argued that in the globalized capitalist economy, the corporation has had no choice but to act as it has done in order to preserve and augment the value of the company for the sake of its shareholders. Well, it's interesting that pressure from shareholder activists in 2007 led the company to announce in its corporate citizenship report of that year that it was committed to ending its support for the network of the think tanks and activist groups attempting to discredit the science underlying climate change. In 2015, last year, a company spokesperson said it was serious about confronting climate change and that it does not fund climate change denial. But in fact,
In spite of its public pledge in 2007 to stop doing so, ExxonMobil later gave more than $2.3 million to members of Congress and a corporate lobbying group that denied climate change. And as regards the interests of investors beyond those shareholder activists, this past November, the Attorney General of New York, Eric Schneiderman, launched an investigation into whether ExxonMobil lied in decades past to the public about the risks of climate change, or lied to investors about how such risks might hurt the oil business. Within the past 2 weeks, attorneys general from Vermont, Maryland, Massachusetts, Virginia, Connecticut, and the Virgin Islands have announced that they are joining the investigation launched by the New York State Attorney General. Now, some legal experts have questioned whether the actions and statements by ExxonMobil can be construed as criminal and outside the protections of the First Amendment. In response, the New York State Attorney General has said, quote, "The First Amendment, ladies and gentlemen, does not give you the right to commit fraud," close quote. I will conclude with the words of the 19th century British philosopher John Stuart Mill, author of the classic work On Liberty, which is highly esteemed by political philosophers ranging from progressive liberals to free market capitalists and libertarians. Open quote, "The source of everything respectable in man, either as an intellectual or as a moral being, is that his errors are corrigible. He is capable of rectifying his mistakes by discussion and experience, not by experience alone. There must be discussion to show how experience is to be interpreted," close quote. Mill argues that what he calls the morality of public discussion requires that the participants speak with candor, without bigotry or intolerance, and without ill will. An important implication of Mill's view is that people should refrain from ad hominem attacks, which is a tactic commonly used by climate change skeptics and deniers. That is, people should not criticize the speaker instead of the speaker's assertions or reasoning. Everyone should, in the words of John Stuart Mill, give merited honor to everyone, whatever opinion he may hold, who has calmness to see and honesty to state what his opponents and their opinions really are, exaggerating nothing to their discredit, and keeping nothing back, which tells or can be supposed to tell in their favor. Thank you. Perhaps Bernard, you would like to speak
Yes.
next?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you everybody for coming on a Friday afternoon. I know that's not the best and easiest time, but I'm really glad to see that many people here. I also want to thank Naomi for coming and giving us this really enlightening and interesting talk. And a lot of what we heard is, I think, incredibly important. As some of you know, one of the fields that I'm teaching is environmental and science journalism. And I'm, of course, really interested in the intersection between the sciences on the one hand and public discourse or the public sphere on the other hand. The public sphere, as we know since Jürgen Habermas's seminal study on the transformation of the public sphere, is the lifeblood of democracy. It is incredibly important. But it requires a vivid and a well-informed public, and that is the crux. Where do we get our information from? That's a very difficult question. We read stuff in the media, but they get their information from somewhere too, and we usually assume they have good sources. They go to experts, they have credible sources, they have first-hand witnesses, they talk to scientists, and that is all true. But if we look at it a second time, we realize a lot of times it is PR, lobbies, interest groups, super PACs, and other very powerful and financially potent groups, and that creates problems. Always problems that we do not necessarily see, because not always do we understand what is a credible and what is not a credible source. And so we are in the middle of the production of doubt, and that is indeed the big problem. Ulrich Beck, who is a sociologist, or was a sociologist, and the well-known author of the Risk Society, talked about this and called it the dialectics of experts and counter-experts, which in the end leaves the public only confused. And Niklas Luhmann, also a very well-known sociologist and main representative of sociological systems theory, talked about this type of confusing expert discourse as something that only creates, as he called it, uncertainty on a high level. We know more, but not necessarily better. And that is the problem. We are informed, but we do not have proper criteria to evaluate the validity of the information that we receive. For journalists, this means that we must not simply report about controversy, which is unfortunately how it always goes, but we need to evaluate which side of the debate has credible evidence to support their claims. In other words, we need to move away from the he said, she said journalism to an informed and critical journalism that does not take the claims of the experts at face value and that does not treat them as equal, because they are not equal. Instead, we as journalists, or as future journalists, as some in this audience are, need to educate ourselves about scientific methods and findings. That's exhausting and difficult, but we need to do this. We need to develop criteria to assess credibility claims and to assess the evidence behind those, or the lack thereof. Because if we know that, then we can actually competently speak about it, and we no longer portray things as a debate where nobody knows who's wrong or right, but where we can actually make informed statements. The NPR actually has exactly moved in this direction. If you read the guidelines of reporting for NPR, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, they introduced a very new and really, in some ways, revolutionary approach, because they say, no, we no longer want to report controversies in a balanced way, because this balance doesn't recognize the fact that these controversies are often the product of confusion strategies, and we now go for the preponderance of evidence. That puts a strong burden on journalists, but it's really important because we understand now as journalists that we are being instrumentalized by the merchants of doubt if we simply report things as open controversy. Nobody knows. Well, there are questions, that kind of stuff, not good. So we need to look at the credentials of experts. We need to look at their interests, like, Jastrow, Seitz, Nierenberg, Singer, those people. We need to study who they are as journalists and also as audience. We need to look at their affiliations. We need to identify people whose job it is to be doubt mongers and who apply these specific PR strategies. These are not journalistic strategies, these are not scientific strategies, these are PR strategies, like the tobacco strategy, to create doubt without a lot of evidence behind it. What we also need to do as journalists, quite obviously, is FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, and public record requests. We need to follow the money trail, we need to follow the trail of lobbies and interests, we need to follow the stories of the individual players in these debates to be able to really talk about them informed and competently. We need to understand the difference between actual scientists and actual scientific debate on the one hand, and paid interest-driven scientists and experts that are not doing their job as scientists, but that are doing a job as public relations agents. And we need to understand the difference between credible and legitimate research institutes on the one hand and lobby-affiliated think tanks and institutes on the other hand. I always cringe when I see how often institutes like the Cato Institute, which probably does good work as an advisory and consulting institute, but should not be used as a scientific source. That's horrible. They don't do science. They just don't. That's not their business. And so we need to understand what business are people in. And for citizens, this also has implications. As citizens, we need to be better and more informed. We need to develop media literacy. Now, to some degree, this is an issue of education, and we all know that education is not doing so well in our country, but it really needs to be taught on every level, primary, secondary, post-secondary. We no longer live in the Gutenberg universe. We live in the digital age. We need to have very, very different and much more complicated understanding of media, understanding of our society, and many other things. This also means we are responsible as individuals. Immanuel Kant talked about that and said, enlightenment is the emergence from self-imposed immaturity. Self-imposed immaturity. We have a choice. Our choice is to stay ignorant or to become informed citizens. That's freedom, but freedom comes with responsibility, and the responsibility is, since we live in a complex society, to be informed citizens and to take this seriously and become participants, active participants in democracy, to partake in public discourse, and to ask critical questions of those who hold political and economic power. And finally, we need to understand the role of externalizing costs. I was so glad that you talked about this, because this is my main thing, actually, when I teach environmental and science journalism. Those of you who have taken this class know this. Externalizing costs is incredibly important. It is really almost like the most important thing to understand if you want to understand why things are where they are, why environmental problems exist, but also, for that matter, why injustice and social inequity exist, because ultimately you can actually always trace it down to cost externalization. Now, the problem is, microeconomically, externalizing costs is absolutely rational and even responsible. It makes stakeholders happy. It makes your business go. But macroeconomically, it's absolutely irrational. And we live in a society that has decided not to deal with this contradiction and has actually put the emphasis, since we believe in hyper-individuality, to put the emphasis on the microeconomic side and glorify cost externalization as a good strategy, while on the macro level, societal, we destroy social relationships, we destroy economic well-being in the long run, and we destroy ecologic well-being. So this is a real problem, and I think something that really needs to be worked on much more than we have done so far. And finally, we also need to ask for effective regulation. Again, I was really happy that you brought this up, because people have a really wrong understanding of regulation. First of all, there is no state of no regulation. There are only different types of regulation. If I leave it all to the so-called free market, we end up with weird monopolies and other strange structures, and very quickly it all collapses. So you can't just say regulation is the devil. It's actually needed. And we have many, many examples where we can see the lack of regulation creates problems. Here in Ohio, we have, for instance, the issue of fracking and wastewater injection. When you talk to politicians, you talk to Kasich or others, they will tell you that Ohio has one of the strongest and strictest regulations with regard to fracking and injection wells. Now, there's some truth to that. The problem is nothing or almost nothing is mandatory. There's great stuff in the Ohio Revised Code, and I've studied it pretty thoroughly. However, it is all voluntary. It's all up to the chief of the oil and gas division at ODNR to ask for that or not. And usually they don't, because why would they? Why would they? Or why would they not? Because ODNR, unfortunately, is very tightly connected to the oil and gas industry. In fact, we have two issues here. One is the revolving door issue. People go in and out of the industry and into government and back. And the other one is ODNR is actually actively profiting from injection wells and from fracking, whereas the communities where it happens have nothing from it other than that their groundwater might be endangered. So this is a real issue and a good example also for how costs are being externalized onto the backs of communities. I really also like the idea of focusing on solutions. This is incredibly important, and we know that the growth of renewables in Seattle is a good example, and keep in mind Seattle is roughly at the latitude of southern Germany, and if you know anything about Europe, Germany and Denmark are the two leading countries in renewables, specifically in photovoltaics and in wind, and they have actually integrated grids. This is why it works so well, and the countries move the energy back and forth as needed, and it's a really well-working system. They have made incredible strides. They actually came to the point where they had to cut subsidies for renewables in Germany because it was getting too much. And with this, I want to close, and again, thank you very much for this really inspiring talk, and give it to Austin.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I thank you very much, Professor Oreskes, for coming and giving a wonderful talk, and my colleagues for working on the organization of this meeting. I'm going to be very brief. I'm going to talk a little bit differently than other folks have been speaking today. I'm going to just talk about some ideas that have come up in the course of a class that I've been teaching this semester, our senior capstone, on the difficulty of climate discourse, climate rhetoric. So out of the course, and out of my opportunity to reflect on these issues with some really wonderful students, some of whom are here, I've got some suggestions where this is a talk about where we go from here. And so I want to just give you some suggestions about the rhetoric of action. So first, about speaking to skeptics. I'm not sure that it makes much sense to talk to skeptics, but inevitably we do. And so we need effective ways to speak to skeptics. And I've got a couple of suggestions about that. First thing, I always ask skeptics, tell me a scientific organization that is skeptical about global warming. Because I can find just somebody that believes that the Earth is carried around on the back of turtles. You can find somebody that believes anything. Tell me about a scientific organization that is skeptical. And give me your email address, because I'll send you a list of 200 plus organizations that accept anthropogenic warming. The other thing that you can do when talking to skeptics is to ask, so who are your sources? This is something that you touched on. Who are your sources? Who are your sources? Are they cherry picking, or do they, like the IPCC, review all the climate research over multiple years in the numbers of thousands of papers reviewed by literally thousands of scientists? You talk a little bit about the way the IPCC works and say, which do you think is going to be a more sensible weighing of the evidence? Speaking to people that are paralyzed with fear is another really important aspect of discourse in this area. A way to talk to people that are paralyzed with fear is to ask, what sorts of information, what sorts of messages are you usually exposed to? I bet most of the time that you hear about the debate and the uncertainty. This is, of course, a huge topic, far too common. Or you hear about the catastrophe looming on the horizon, approaching ever faster. How often do you hear about the sort of things that Dr. Oreskes Closter talked with, where you learn about things that are available right now, that individuals, communities, and governments are doing right now that are available, accessible to our, within arm's reach. Of course, if you're going to focus on the nonsense about denial, and if you're going to focus on the threat, that's going to be scary as hell. You should be paralyzed. But why focus on that when there's so many really important things that are available to us right now? Speaking to, well, actually, and on that same issue, like one other thing that you ask them if they've heard much discussion about which would be a better approach to dealing with climate. Should we take the green capitalist approach that's promoted by some, and a lot of folks have never even heard of this idea of green capitalism, which is astonishing, and then folks that take a socialistic stance on climate. We should be having debates about that. Bernie Sanders has opened up public space for the first time in recent history where people can actually be socialists and not be tarred and feathered and run out of town.
Not yet, anyway.
There was a dissertation by a woman in our department just a very few years ago about the use of the term socialized medicine to demonize single-payer health insurance. That's been going on since the beginning of the 20th century. So this is not a, but Bernie Sanders has created some space for us now. Why are we not discussing these ideas? And as Professor Debatine said, the idea of the public sphere, we know, since Aristotle we know, that the more inclusive social discourses, the better the opportunity we have for meaningful and optimal solutions. It's when you constrict the space for social discourse that you begin to make suboptimal decisions. So why are we not talking about that particular debate? We're just talking about what does the science say. For people, talking to people that are just generally unmotivated, I recommend that you discuss with them the idea of intergenerational justice. Every child that you see walking around is somebody that's going to be questioning you in a very short number of years about what you were doing today. You know the song by Pete Seeger, My Name is Lisa Calvage, about a German woman busted for protesting during the Vietnam War. Why did she do that? Because she was stopped coming to the United States when she immigrated here with her GI husband after World War II, and was questioned what was she doing during the war. She didn't have a particularly good thing to say. She didn't want her children to be asked, what were you and what were your parents doing? Because she was asked about her parents. What were you and your parents doing during the war? She wanted to have something that she could be proud of. If you speak to people that are what we might call global experimenters, people that want to seed the oceans with materials that will reflect heat back off into space, to these people, I think it's useful to say that we should stop, already get the message. We should not be trying to control, and the new word is manage, nature. What we ought to be trying to do is learn from nature how to live harmoniously in nature. And lastly, when you're speaking to yourself, here I think we need to take a second and just pause. Two of the greatest threats that we face from related to global warming are ideas that we've known for a long, long time. One of them is social loafing, or the social diffusion of responsibility, the Kitty Genovese effect, the bystander effect. It's such a big problem. People are thinking about it, people are working on it, I don't have to do anything. Well, nonsense. This is such a large problem, we all have to do something. The other thing is, another problem, very big problem, is social validation. When people are not sure, is this an issue? What should I do? Is this something that really I need to be working on? I need to be active about? They look around to see what other people are doing. That's social validation. And compounding the problem is something called pluralistic ignorance. When I'm not sure what to do, and I look at you to see if I can figure out what you're doing so I decide whether I should make this part of my daily life, and I see you doing nothing, then I am reassured I don't have to do anything. But I don't realize that you're looking at me because you don't know what to do. And so this is the concept of pluralistic ignorance. We must do things to overcome social validation of inaction. We need to do things to overcome the social loafing. And for this I have a very specific recommendation. And that is that we escalate our commitment. We willfully escalate our commitment. You're here already, so you're thinking about climate. What else can you do? You may be involved in, so Vicki Matson has gone Next Gen. If you're on campus or you're a student, contact Vicki Matson and the folks in Next Gen. Or contact the Student Sierra Club. Do we have a Student Sierra Club representatives here? Well, they're around campus, they are active, they were very instrumental in working to get us off coal.
They already told us all this, they didn't have to
No,
go.
Lorraine is here for
Lorraine
Student
is
Sierra
here.
Club.
Sierra Club. So we have representatives of Student Sierra Club here and Sierra Club generally. Dick McGinn is here. If you're not already involved in it, get involved in the campaign to get a county charter. There are all sorts of things that we can do, but we need to think about escalating our commitment. This is how we carry the weight that we have, that is ours to carry and no one else's to carry. That's how we're going to move ahead on climate, by learning to talk a little bit differently than we have, asking more of ourselves.